There is an argument that in some ways one of the most important centuries in human history is one we're in now, but I'm not talking about 2001 to 2100. I'm talking about a particular 100-year period from 1945 to 2045, because I think in two very important ways that century is the century in which the entire evolution of human society over many tens of thousands of years reaches a peak point. 1945 is easy because that is when nuclear weapons were first demonstrated. For the first time in human history, we developed the capacity to kill ourselves on a gigantic, almost a global scale. That had never happened before, even with mechanized warfare, the trench warfare. This was really on a new order of magnitude greater. The last 50 to 60 years, we've come through that without doing it, without destroying ourselves, but it's been touch and go, and we've been lucky. But at least we're starting to learn how to handle our own capacity for our own self-destruction. And what has happened in the nuclear field, with leading figures of the Cold War now saying we've got to think about a nuclear-free world, is a step in the right direction. We're on the slippery slope, there's still dangers, but it's not at the level and intensity of 30, 40 years ago. So there, in that sense, in the century, we're making some progress. But then you have the second one, living within the scope to actually destroy our environment, primarily through climate change, but also with resource depletion and loss of biodiversity and the rest. I think between now and 2045, we've really got to move to an era where we overcome that part of our capacity for destruction. And this is why that century as a whole, I think, is going to be seen maybe in 100 years' time as being the really significant period. And one must be cautiously optimistic that we can do the changes. If we're looking very broadly in terms of overall world trends, and we're looking over the next 20 to 30 years, I would say there are four factors. One is that the way the world economy has developed, particularly in the neoliberal era of the last 30 years, has been economic growth, but more and more divided. Most of the new wealth has accrued to about 1/5 of the global population. It's not just rich country. It's spread across the world with large, rich communities, middle-class communities in China and India. But the gap between the richest fifth and all the rest has actually grown widely. And that seems to be an enduring trend, which is leading to a lot of frustration and anger, what I call revolts from the margins. Second factor is, in fact, a great success. There's been huge success over the last 40 years in improvements in education, literacy, communication. And that's really hugely welcome. But the downside of that is, of course, many people now know they're on the margins. Years ago in the West, we used to talk about the revolution of rising expectations, the consumer revolution. Things were getting better for everybody. We now face the revolution of frustrated expectations. And there's a connection between revolts from the margins, like the neo-Maoist Naxalites that caused so many problems in India, with things like the Occupy movement and the others in Greece and Spain and elsewhere, who see themselves more and more marginalized. But you've got two more factors, and one which is coming up is environmental constraints, particularly climate change, which is going to have a huge effect on human well-being. And the final one is we do business by trying to maintain control. The attitude in Western security is maintain the status quo, lidism. You keep the lid on things rather than going to the underlying factors. Now, most of this analysis, those first 3 points, the divisions, the knowledge, and the environmental constraints, military think tanks will accept that. And they will have a similar analysis. But their job professionally is to keep their country or their alliance secure. And they have less concern, because of their own careers, if you like, it's natural enough, with actually preventing these things happening in the first place. And so you get changes in military attitudes which are directed at keeping the lid on things. This is the situation we're in now. We're not really woken up to the fact we've got to rethink the basis of international security. I certainly think we need wise leadership and leadership of people who are prepared, in a sense, to take some risks and also to look long term. People were very hopeful about Obama. Some changes were brought in, but of course he was operating in an environment where there is huge opposition to this kind of thing. And so I think, in a sense, if we say we need the good leadership to take us forward, we're putting our faith in individuals when we have to take more responsibility. And you're more likely to get those kinds of people coming forward if you have a groundswell of far more people who are really saying this is what we have to do and how we have to live and how we're living personally and the changes that need to happen. So I think there's a hugely important element of what you might call the value of civil society producing the groundswell for the change. That combined with the scientific work showing what the dangers are going to be and the real new thinking about how we can operate things, they can all come together in a single transitionary phase. There are many causes for optimism, and one must appreciate this. There are some ways in which technologies could help, and the speed at which they can be taken up. The transformation of communications in Africa with the coming of the mobile phone. The way in which if you get a really major breakthrough in things like photovoltaics, direct production of electricity from the sun, and the price coming down and down, people will very quickly take up those technologies. But I suppose the real thing is that we're now coming to appreciate that we've actually got to cooperate much more together. And in some ways, I think the economic financial crisis of the last 4 years is very much a wake-up call. I mean, the system of the free market economy is not delivering sustainability and it's not delivering equity and emancipation. And basically we had to find new ways. I suppose in a way I would say that the current decade, the 2010s, is a key decade because this is when we have to start making these transitions. I have a personal definition of prophecy. I call prophecy suggesting the possible. And we're really in the era where we have to look at the better ways of doing things and promoting them as much as we can. There's one way of looking at this, it's a traditional way which says things have got to get worse before people wake up and they'll get better. There's some truth in that, but my own view is that the more you suggest possible ways forward, the less things have to get worse before we say we know how to make them better. And you don't have to have disasters which prompt people to actually make the changes. And this is why the kind of work that is being done by some of the think tanks and others now is so really important, because it's suggesting the ways of doing things better.